Um, yes, I have been asked multiple times to play a skeptic, but nevertheless, I'm really, really honored to be given this opportunity today. So let's dive right in. As Ravi has also suggested, I mean, my first question I would direct to Arvind. Um, so one of the things that you primarily do in the book is you take the 1975 emergency as one of the comparative references, and while the stories of suppression of rights of dissent are very popular for the 1975 emergency, today, however, this situation hasn't gathered that kind of popular support. I'm saying this also because when Ravi asked me to play this role of a skeptic, I immediately called up some family members who are very well known to author some of those WhatsApp messages. So I wanted to just understand. So a very frequent thought that comes up is that it hasn't touched home, so we are not responding. It isn't really a crisis because it hasn't touched home. Firstly, what do you have to say to that? Do you think it hasn't touched home? I'll follow up after that.
Thanks, Ravi, for this opportunity, and thanks, Aishwarya, for the question. And I think the question, in effect, is why do you call this contemporary movement the undeclared emergency? Why do you see the emergency as a comparative point? And I think there are many possible points of comparison, but the point of comparison I focus very, very strongly on is during the emergency, the use of the Maintenance of Internal Security Act to jail. The question is, why compare it with the emergency period? Why compare the contemporary period with the emergency? And in the book itself, I look at one very, very strong indicator, which is the use of, in the context of the emergency, the preventive detention laws, which is the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, under which thousands of people were imprisoned, and the comparative indicator in the contemporary context, which is the use of the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act as well as the National Investigation Agency Act, as ways in which opposition voices are stifled and people are arrested under these laws. Of course, lawyers will make the point that there is a difference between the UAPA and the Maintenance of Internal Security Act. The MISA is clearly a preventive detention law. There's no ambiguity about it. The argument I make in the book is the UAPA is a de facto preventive detention law and actually more dangerous in some ways than the MISA. The reason I make this case is this. If you look at the MISA provision itself, the maximum period of detention under MISA was 1 year. And even under the Rowlatt Act in the British colonial times, the maximum period of detention was 2 years. And the stories which have come to us from really around the country in terms of conferences and meetings organized with the People's Union of Civil Liberties indicates that under the UAPA, people have spent up to 10 plus years in jail and finally acquitted by the Sessions Court or the NIA court, as it were. So in effect, the UAPA functions as a de facto preventive detention law. The thing about a de jure preventive detention law is it is preventive detention. And there is a range of opposition builds up to it. But as far as the UAPA is concerned, I feel the abuse has gone a little under the radar. Perhaps the most popular, or the one which we know best in this country as of now is really the PK-16, who have been also arrested under the UAPA. That's a story we all know. But it's interesting or it's sad or it's tragic that the stories like this really around the country of people who are arrested for what you call speech offenses. Basically, they've said something which the government finds offensive and they're picked up or arrested under that particular law. That's one kind of a law which I look at as a comparative indicator. And the undeclared part of it you get from the way de facto versus de jure functions. And the second law which I look at a little more closely is the National Investigation Agency Act and how the NIA has been functioning, on an everyday basis. And again, you look at the NIA, the kinds of arrests which you see under the NIA are basically, again, by and large, what you'd call speech offenses.
offenses which should be covered within the realm of speech and expression should not be offenses at all. So that's one part of the comparison. The second part of the comparison, which I try and flesh out, is a slightly more abstract point, which is the fact that the emergency was accompanied by a sense of fear, a palpable sense of fear, and people felt if we say something, we could be arrested. And you get that same smell of fear in the contemporary context. People are scared that if they express their opinion, they could be picked up and they could be arrested. That's the second point of comparison. And the third point of comparison I go to, in terms of the declared and the undeclared, is the failure of other institutions of accountability. During the emergency period, the press, L.K. Advani most famously said, you were asked to bend, you crawled. That is one complete failure. And the second failure was the judiciary. And again, we all know the ADM double pool judgment and the majority, which basically said, if you look at the majority judgment, what did the majority say? The majority basically made the point that even under the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, that we are not going to look at the fact, is there a conformity with that particular law? And look at the tragic part, of course, is 9 high courts said to the contrary. 9 high courts basically said that if you are detained and your detention is not signed by the detaining authority, if the detaining authority is not able to do satisfaction that you satisfy the clauses under MISA, then the detention can be challenged before the court. Supreme Court basically says that that this cannot be questioned because on grounds of national security. That's the argument that the Supreme Court takes. Of course, maybe we'll get into this later, but the dissenting judgment of ADM, I go a little bit in dissenting judgment of Justice Khanna, and how that remains a sign of hope even in that difficult time. But I think the comparative point is really the judiciary as well. And to what extent has the judiciary failed in the contemporary context as well to fulfill its constitutional responsibility? And that's in terms of the abdication of constitutional responsibility, where a range of cases, very, very important matters have come up before it, and they refuse to take cognizance or respond to that, be it Article 370, be it the CAA, or be it a range of other cases where the judiciary has really failed to ensure accountability. So this is the point of comparison between then and now, as it were.
Thanks, Arvind. I'd like to continue maybe expand my question a little more. And I'd like to invite Leo to maybe respond to this. That what I meant also was that there is a silent majority today. And there is a silent majority that doesn't think that the crisis at hand elicits a response. Arvind beautifully put together what he has presented in the book as an argument as to why today could be called an undeclared emergency. But Leo, because you have also been someone who has been very vocal and been very on the ground exercising your right to dissent, I want to understand, what do you read in this silence of the majority, and what do you think lies behind that silence?
Thank you. Later, if I get a chance, I want to read out a small passage from a book. It's also a teaser for all of us to see if anyone can recognize who wrote that. But yes, your question, I would say that the broad categorization of the majority being silent, I don't agree with. Okay? Because I work with diverse communities across India. And everywhere I work, there is dissent and expression of dissent, an argument which is taken against very powerful state, very demonic state in some instances, and in particular instances, militarized state. And people have been doing that for decades. Okay, so for instance, let me take the example of the POSCO project in Orissa, right? People shut the gates of their village to the surveyors for 5 years. Okay, they've underwent horrible, impact of that. A kind of a self-imposed emergency against the state, against the outside world, right? If you go to the Northeast, I work in many states there and with many friends who are part of the Human Rights Network. And you can feel the militarization there almost everywhere you go, right? And yet you find an expression which is, I wouldn't say brave, a very intelligently crafted expression. Some of them have taken to arms against the idea of the Indian state itself, like the Naga rebels. Of all the things that has been said in the last 7 years, the one thing that you can recall is the impossibility of Narendra Modi making peace with the Naga rebels. N. Ravi was there, tried a lot. But where is the peace accord? But let's also look at it this way. The 1996 peace accord that Devegowda crafted stays even today. And I have a little story about what that was. Devegowda understood that there is going to be a massive disruption of the state of order there if he doesn't talk to the people directly there. They said, I will not talk to you in India. So he said, you pick a place where I can talk to you. And as Prime Minister, he went to Zurich. And I met the family who made him Ragi Mudde, and he stayed there for 4 days. Now you see, that is the expression of a state willing to express a desire to the dissenter and saying, you have taken arms, you are against the Indian state, but still I'm willing to talk to you. Right? So that is how India has crafted itself. Now, of course, we have extreme forms of violence there. We saw it in Punjab. We are seeing it in central India. We are seeing it, the Naxal movement, in parts of Andhra Pradesh, in parts of Karnataka also. But you don't see the fact that the government is willing to talk to the dissenter. And I think that degeneration did not start with this regime. It started with Chidambaram. When he very famously said, or infamously said, India is willing to tolerate dissent so long as it doesn't come in the way of 8% growth. So you see, the problem is the idea of capitalist progress, as they put it, is what has brought us to where we are now. That the capitalists are financing the breakdown of democracy and the emergence of an autocratic rule. Right, so I agree in a sense, to what, you should also see it from an economic rationale. It's far more easier for you to actually manage by not having to talk to everybody. So there is a majority which is obviously dissenting, and POSCO is one example. We have dissented everywhere. Every time we go and break a rule. I mean, one of the funny things we did, I don't know if you were there, but Clifton was there, and we all walked into the BBMP office. Jyotirma Lingam was the commissioner, and he was not willing to listen to a very serious argument we had against what he was doing, which was terrible, And so they went on, 50 became 100 became 150. And then suddenly somebody locked us all in and threw the keys of the BBMP out. So we were sitting there, Jyotirma Lingam as commissioner couldn't go out, police are outside, and we are inside talking to him. Now, I'm just saying this because this happened in 2004, right? Would it happen now? So that's one way to imagine what has happened to the state itself. The state has fortified itself physically. The fact that you cannot protest, like the protest which was called off just last week against the hijab, imposition of hijab. And I was thinking 2 years ago when Chief Justice Oka here, or Oak, if you read his order saying 144 cannot be used arbitrarily, he actually makes a case for the fact that dissent, he says something very simple. He says it doesn't matter what they're saying. You have no power to control it. And when we fought for that order, I remember how we held the city to ransom, if you want to put it that way. But it was necessary to hold the state and the public to ransom. And the silent majority agreed that that was a just fight. So I would say that the pandemic has made an appearance at a time when democracy was reviving. The whole protest against CAA across the country, the protest against Article 370, the farmers' protests, the majority is definitely not silent. It's just that, of course, the media has completely sold itself out. Like, not only have the crawling, I don't know what else they're digging themselves under the boots. Right? So this, I think, is what we see. So we should not see it from the lens of representation of the mainstream media, but the felt experiences of the communities who continue to resist.
Thank you so much, Leo. That was a very powerful, for me also, when I was framing this response, I was coming from that representational or majoritarianism from that angle. And thank you. I mean, one of the things that you pointed at was how the state has fortified itself. And one of the, in my mind, one of the most important things that the book also talks about, and what I would like to invite Aparna to talk about, is the role of courts, the judiciary, and the law. So how does the judiciary play a role in create in almost fueling the crisis today? Because as Leo has also pointed out, CAA, farm laws, UAPA, anti-conversion laws, the abrogation of Article 370 laws, and that laws have been one of the most significant tools at the hand of the state. And can you tell our audience, firstly, is this a new phenomenon? And is this something to worry about? And if so, can you explore how? What is the role of the judiciary?
Thanks for that, Aishwarya. I actually want to start by saying something in response to the questions that you asked Arvind and Leo, and then tie that to the question that you've asked me. I think one other commonality between the emergency of the declared emergency and the undeclared emergency is also how the federal structure of the state has been systematically decimated, right? So one of the things that happened during the emergency was the use of Article 356 to dismiss state governments. And what you're seeing now is not so much the use of Article 356, but other mechanisms through which the opposition or the alternative point of view that can come from the various state governments is being decimated. And that's through the use of criminal provisions, that is through the use of outright corruption, that is through the use of the governor's power, so on and so forth, right? So the subversion of the federal state. To the point that Leo made, which I agree with, is that there's a manufactured sense of a majority support for the current regime. One of the reasons, just one amongst many other reasons, and Leo pointed to some of them, but one of the reasons why there is a sense that there is a majority support and that makes sort of fighting it that much more difficult is also because of our electoral rules. Now, I am not the sort of person who says that everything boils down to the law or to legal institutions, etc., but there is a role that some of these things play. So the kind of, for example, the first past the post electoral system that we have creates majorities or sense of majority out of actually very small numbers, right? So there's a sense, therefore, that someone can speak as having the mandate of the majority and the mantle of the majority when they don't. What links these two things together is to the question that you asked me, is the role that our constitution, our laws, and our institutions, including the courts, have played in getting us to the present moment. So to answer your questions directly, no, this is not a new phenomenon. Yes, the courts have been complicit. As I was reading Arvind's book, I thought, courts have been cheerleaders of this regime. But in reflecting on it more, I think they've led from the front in many ways. And this is not a new phenomenon. So Arvind touched upon ADM Jabalpur and how the Supreme Court gave a stamp of legitimacy to the emergency regime, right? So it's not just by saying that, we will not scrutinize these detentions. If you look at the language that the court uses in ADM Jabalpur, judges say, the care to which detainees are put, the care with which detainees are taken care of is almost maternal, right? That's the kind of language that you're getting from the Supreme Court. But there's a clear line between what the court is doing then and what the court is doing now and what the court has done in between. So right after the emergency, apparently it is a court that is seeking what Upendra Bakshi has famously called new basis of legitimation, and it's looking to wipe the sins of its past, and therefore it creates this whole PIL jurisprudence, etc., etc. But at the same time, it upholds the National Security Act in A.K. Roy. It upholds TADA, which actually the legislature allows to lapse. It upholds POTA, which actually the legislature repeals. It upholds AFSPA. And of course, we've seen, and Arvind's book talks about how the court has interpreted UAPA, right? So there is there is a story that we tell ourselves about the courts, that they are the guarantors and the protectors of rights. And it's a nice story to tell ourselves. But if you look beneath the surface of the kind of grand expositions that the courts give, except for rhetorical flourishes in terms of what you actually get from the courts, that's not very much. So that's in terms of generally, what the courts have done. But in this present moment, many of the things that we think are going wrong, that Arvind points to as evidence of of our decline from a democracy to a totalitarian state, have happened not just with the complicity of the courts, but have been actually court-led. So NRC is a classic example, right, where the court pushes the state. I mean, that's not the whole story, but definitely it's a court acting as the court orders upon orders which are pushing the government to say, no, you have to do NRC in Assam. But through its silence, giving sort of, again, de facto approval to something like Article 370, or to the lockdown and the denials that are happening in Kashmir, to the electoral bond scheme, which is again directly tied to the kind of electoral politics that we have. So the court has definitely been a big player, but there have been other failures as well, right? So other institutional failures. The thing that I'm sure Arvind has a lot of sort of views on, but don't make it to the book, is the role of the legislature. Right? Where is the legislature in this story? And if you look at, again, our sort of long history, from the Constitution itself down to the present moment, has been a story of the gradual decimation of the legislature, or the decay of the legislature as an institution that holds the executive to check. And one big part of that is in 1980s, when basically the 10th schedule comes in, and it says that essentially you can't dissent from the party whip. Right? And there might have been good reasons for it or not at that moment, but that's had an impact. In the Aadhaar case, what the court says is essentially making Rajya Sabha irrelevant. Right? Essentially making it irrelevant in the sense that when the executive wants to push through an agenda, it can push through an agenda without having to go through the Rajya Sabha, because it can just, call anything a money bill. And the court has approved that. And the growth of ordinances, right, where the executive essentially is legislating without really having to get legislative approval. So in those ways, the legislature's role has been decimated. The judiciary we've already spoken about. The fourth, what are called the fourth branch institutions, or the other institutions that hold the executive to check, the election commission. I mean, where is the election commission? So there is, I think, an all-round institutional decay that is happening. Courts are definitely complicit in it. But I think we also have to think about the constitutional structures that we have set up, which there might have been good reasons to set up the structures the way they were set up in 1950. But we need, when the moment of reckoning comes, as I'm sure it will come, for the present moment, in our path forward, we have to think about how we make sure that going forward, these institutions work to hold the executive in check and do not allow for this kind of concentration of powers in the hands of the executive, and even more dangerous, in the hands of one or two people.
Thanks, Aparna. I mean, you've really, there was a really brilliant how you've spoken about a larger institutional decay. According to you, in your opinion, why should a regular citizen be concerned about this? Leo touched upon the fact that there is dissent. There is no silence, as I had asked in the beginning. There is dissent on the ground. So if there is dissent, what has this institutional decay got to do with those dissenters or with the non-dissenters? Why should a citizen be concerned about this decay?
Right. You said something right at the top of this discussion, where you said that for many people this hasn't touched home. And I would think that it has touched home. And so, like you before this session, I was speaking to family members who would not agree with any of the views here. And I was speaking to my dad, and I told him that I'm going to be on this panel. And he said, be careful what you say. Right? And I am like, how is this not touched home? Right? And how can you support a regime where you have to be concerned about the safety of your family members? Of course, his response to that was, I made a mistake in allowing you to become a lawyer, which is its own thing. But anyway, so the idea is, I don't know that it hasn't touched home. It's just that sense of as Ravi put it, maybe the termites are holding up the system, and so you don't get a sense of what's happening behind the scenes. But I just want to say something about what happens when you normalize the kind of legal culture that has become normalized, right? And again, Arvind very nicely sort of takes us through the dual state and the idea of the normative arrangement being overrun by the prerogative arrangement. But if you look at what has been happening, right, the sort of being boiled slowly thing that has been happening in the space of criminal law. Right? Many of us might think, we are never going to face the brunt of the criminal law. So why should we care about, say, for example, the rights of the accused? But again, the UAPA did not spring up on its own. Right? There's a long history, like I said. You have the NDPS Act, which comes in the 1980s, and it starts shifting the burden of proof and changing these bail provisions. And then that's taken into TADA. Right? That is taken into POTA. That's taken into all your organized crime legislations, MACOCA, etc. That is what is coming into UAPA. Right? And when it is against drug dealers, of course, these are, druggies, who cares about them? When it isn't TADA, you think, oh, this is against terrorists, what do I care? It's against organized crime people, what do I care? By the time it reaches home, it's already too late. But the other thing is, it's not just about the exceptional, it's also about the ordinary. So just with respect to the criminal law, UAPA is one thing. Sedition law is part of our quote-unquote normal law, right? Conspiracy is a part of our normal law. Creating enmity amongst groups, silencing dissent is part of those kind of provisions are part of our normal law. And it's all fine to say that, there is the UAPA, and the UAPA has taken away power from the judges to actually give bail, where judges do have the power to give bail if they are not giving bail. Right? You can give the judges all the power, but they have to exercise that power, right? And if you've normalized a view which says that you should not give bail, bail is the way in which you keep people in check, right? You have to make the process the punishment because you have all these procedural safeguards. You have to do away with these procedural safeguards, or you have to make the process the punishment. That is going to seep into the law that you and I will encounter, right? So in that sense, everyone should care, because once that culture is normalized, that culture where whatever the state says goes, then the moment you have to face the state, wherever you have to face the state, and we can't live in silos where we never have to encounter the state. When you have to face the state, who is left to protect you? That's where Arvind ends his book, but that's exactly the question. So this is not about the exceptional, it's about the exceptional becoming the ordinary. Perhaps it's already become the ordinary, but it's becoming the ordinary while you don't realize that, to mix all my metaphors, you don't realize that you're being boiled slowly in the water. Yeah.
Thanks, Aparna. Arvind, can you help elaborate on, Aparna has now spoken about why this is no longer something that we need to worry about a distant future, why this has touched home, and why one of the main reasons is that there is a culture of fear and there is a culture of accepting or obedience to what the state says. Can you help elaborate on who is facing the danger of this culture, who's facing the brunt of it, or what kind of communities are facing the brunt of it? And I think I'd opened that up to Leo and Arvind, but yeah, I want to invite both of you to answer.
Thanks, Aishwarya. And I think the part of the comparison between the declared emergency and the undeclared emergency is in terms of the Indira Gandhi regime and the Modi regime. But I think the other part which I have in the book is what I call slouching towards totalitarianism. And I think the important part of that is to indicate that this is a regime which has a totalitarian ambition.
Sorry, can you just tell our audience what is totalitarianism?
I'm just getting to that point. By a totalitarian ambition, what you mean is a desire, in a sense, to have a total control over human beings. And one dimension of that we're seeing in terms of the be it the what is ordinarily called love jihad laws, the anti-beef laws, or the CAA, all of which are really about controlling, in a sense, intimate parts of yourself, who you choose to worship, who you choose to fall in love with, who is a citizen of this country. These are dimensions which the laws attempt to control. And that's something we've not seen in previous regimes. That's one step forward, as it were. The other part which you see in terms of this, what we call a slouching towards the totalitarian future, is the sense of an intolerance towards alternative or different viewpoints or dissenting viewpoints. Again, I think there's no way out, but really go back to what the fact that this regime, end of the day, is based on a certain kind of a ideological framework, is based on a certain kind of an ideological thinking. And again, the comparison with the previous regime, be it the Indira Gandhi regime, is people have argued, Jafar Low and Anil in particular have argued, that the commitment to socialism was skin deep at best. They didn't have that kind of deep ideologically held belief in socialism. And you look at the Shah Commission and the fact that Shah Commission imprisons really a range of trade union leaders, and you realize they didn't really build that popular support. This regime has built or has that kind of a popular support underlying it. So there's a way in which you go back to the ideological fountainhead, be it Golwalkar or Savarkar, and the idea which Golwalkar puts, which is, you look at his book, Bunch of Thoughts, he says 3 threats. Christians, it's as direct as that. Christians, Muslims, and communists. I think communists can be read a lot more broadly to include liberals, include dissenters, include the BK16, include a range of people really. So again, the imperative of totalitarianism, I think this is again, it's a very, which Bhikkhu Parekh makes this point in a book on Hannah Arendt actually. He says that the imperative of totalitarianism is to deal or to control all dissenting viewpoints. Be it the trade union leader asking for higher or demanding higher wages, be it the student in class expressing a different opinion, be it in our particular context, be it the Muslim woman who chooses to wear a hijab, be it the person who chooses to work among Adivasi communities and says that, their right to land is an important issue. So a range, you ask who's being targeted by this regime, is really all people the regime perceives as dissenters. Even as we speak, the Christian community believed that it was immune from the kinds of pressures to which the Muslim community was subjected to. And today, again, I just want to bring people's attention to the anti-conversion law. It's titled an anti-conversion law, but if you read that particular law, what it defines as an offense is what it calls allurement for the purpose of conversion. You read the definition of allurement. Allurement would be that if I offer you any medical facility, any educational facility, for free for the purpose of conversion. It shifts, again, the burden of proof. Again, going back, of course, to older history of shifting the burden of proof. But what it basically means is tomorrow, you and me apply for a particular college, St. Joseph's College. You get in, I don't. I'm very upset with the fact that you got in. I'm going to go and file a case against the principal of St. Joseph's College, basically saying that, you're alluring for the purpose of conversion. Then let the principal prove in court later on that he was not alluring. So the point being, if this is not an attack on the Christian community, what is an attack on the Christian community? If you look at the hijab issue, what is the hijab issue really about? Again, we go on the facts of the point, right? We've gotten this, I feel, very abstract discussion on is an hijab an essential practice. I don't think that's the core issue. If you look at the facts on the ground, the fact is these 6 women in Kundapur were prevented from entering the college gates. There's no law on the basis. It's an arbitrary denial of the right to education, and that's the purpose underlying that particular regime action, as it were. And so there's if you ask the question who's being targeted, if you look at the farm law protests, farmers. If you look at the protests with respect to the labor codes, it's workers. If you look at the question of arrest of Munawar Faruqi, it's humorists. If you look at the question of a range of dissenters, it's intellectuals. If you look at Baravar Rao and others in jail, if you look at the question of again the BK16 and the arrest of the Kabir Kala Manch and Anand Taltunde and others, it's people who believe that from a Dalit perspective, people who believe that, in Ambedkar's words, that Hindutva or Hindu Raj will be the greatest calamity this country will ever experience, right? So it's that grouping as well. It's Adivasi rights activists, which stands for me and others, and it's people who challenge the state. And if you look at Gautam Navlakar and Rona Wilson, what is the viewpoint they're putting forward? They're challenging the idea of a state within a state. They're challenging the idea of a secret state. They're saying intelligence agencies need to be accountable. They're saying the Indian army needs to be accountable. They're saying the Indian police needs to be accountable. So it's really, I think, in the broadest possible way, sooner or later, everybody differs from a certain uniform mainstream viewpoint put forward by the ideologues of the Hindu right. All of them will be targeted.
Leo, do you want to add to that? Because
I just want to add to the thread which is evolving here. And I just want to say this, that, if you actually, one of the problems I have is in believing that there is a undeclared emergency now. I believe, as I have said before, there has been resistance against, let's say, AFSPA in the Northeast, for instance, in Jammu and Kashmir. And what are they arguing for? That the military needs to be tamed. That military is not an exigent force which is outside the framework of law. Basically, that's what it is. And human rights are fundamental, which is protected by the UN Charter. And they have gone to UN because they have found no remedy within the parliamentary system, parliamentary democracy. Those groups have gone to UN forums and argued for their rights to be protected. That means the state has failed for them. Right? It's not just from the kind of skirmishes that you hear now and then that you realize the state has failed, but the lived experience of these people is that there is no state which works for them, right? So the idea of an undeclared emergency, in contrast with what happened in June 75, is not necessarily the experience for most people. I also want to say that this is a region, I wouldn't say country, where oppression is systematized through caste and class. So if you are not from the right caste, you are all the time living in a state of emergency that we must always acknowledge. It is just that it is not a political statement that anyone is making, but the social, economic disparities that condition creates. Obviously, it means, that is why Ambedkar in that Mahat Satyagraha speech, he basically metaphorizes the whole thing by saying even cattle can drink from this pond, but you and I cannot. Is the reality any different? And in 5 years' time, it will be a century since he made that speech, right? So I think we must always consciously be aware of the fact that there is that underlying theme that caste and class oppression has played a huge part in the concentration of power and wealth, especially political power and wealth. Just look at the nature of politics today. Look at the kind of politicians we have here as MLAs. Every one of them is from the real estate lobby. No exceptions. I don't know MP. Tejaswi Surya's uncle is also a real estate broker and he's an MLA himself. Right? And I have seen it, how they have worked, for instance, in the Girinagar and the South Bangalore area and so on. But I want to say something else also. That if you look at the politics of Sanjay Gandhi, he used land as a tool to terrorize. Right, the notion of a world-class city, which obviously Narayan Murthy and Nandan Nilekani and others absorbed, embraced as part of the BATF mechanism, right, which SM Krishna pushed aggressively. What was that about? It was exercising the power to abuse power. Because the constitution did not allow you to represent the imagination for what is now 14 million people, and it was 10 million people, based on if you are a billionaire or a millionaire. The constitution argues in Article 39 for, amongst the other things that it says, in Article 39 it says that this is a country which says that the means of economic development shall not be based on disparity. Tell me which other constitution says that. It makes an argument for economic equality. So caste and class oppression was meant to be attacked. And we did not do that. And in 76, for instance, you see the Bangalore Development Authority Act is a child of emergency. And I keep asking, is there any empirical evidence of this? I've never had the time to do it, but I hope somebody has done it, or if somebody has not done it, we must do it. Look at Bangalore. Why are the Muslims all in one corner of Jayanagar, or in Banshankari, or in Fraser Town? In the past there was ghettoization. The British actually did that. Blackpalli was a place where the Indians were supposed to be. And the fact that, it is called Blackpalli was such a racial apartheid that was imposed on us. But isn't it also an apartheid that was imposed on Muslims in particular, that the allotment of their sites, you and I go. You have a Brahmin name, he has a Lingayat name, I have a Christian name, we get to be assimilated in Bangalore area. But how is it that 4 or 5 lanes is only where the Muslims got allotments? Wasn't there any randomization possible at all? Just look at the fabric of the city itself. And I'm saying that this has happened in every city. And it has happened from the 1950s laws, 1960s laws, where how people end up where they live and work is largely based on an identity. And that identity has been enforced. And in the emergency, it was weaponized through land use laws. And unless we acknowledge that and, we start talking about it, now there is an active cultural and social and political assertion that you shall not be part of me. You shall not be part of this mainstream society. It is militant. And that is why the judiciary has to play a role which is above all this. And we are seeing case after case after case. It's really frightening how even the argument for, why would we even think of, just go back 30, 40 years when I was a kid when the emergency was, and all I remember about the emergency was Indira Gandhi everywhere. The sycophantic culture. And isn't that the same now? You see? So I think we really have to think through what we have not done as well. And here I feel one of the arguments we also must be aware of, and there is a bill that has been tabled in Parliament yesterday by P. Wilson. He is a member of Parliament from DMK. Very interesting bill. And he says that the education, for instance, should be taken out of the concurrent list and put as independent actions of the union list and the state list. And in the News Minute, there's a very good analysis of why he says that. And I would encourage you, it's come today. And I was thinking, we have allowed education to be monopolized by the center. And he says, if you want to actually talk about diversity, we have allowed education to sit in the framework of the center, which imposes uniformity through language, through cultural assimilation, enforcement of a certain way of thinking. And look at how the RSS, for instance, has taken the education policy and turned it into a tool to completely indoctrinate millions and millions of children. When they grow up, their idea of India is very different from the idea that I had as a child. My idea of India was, I never thought about my teacher coming in a burqa as a different, or my Anglo-Indian teacher coming in a frock, or my other teachers coming in sari. It never was a thought in my head. But now, as Arvind has said, every personal choice has become, you have to be conscious about the political statement we are making. You just cannot be yourself. You cannot be ordinary. Every time you walk, you are not, the anonymity is gone. And the idea of anonymity is very, very important. For instance, if I am a Dalit, the city is a great place to anonymize myself and become part of this larger thing where I can just forget the oppression in my village. Today, if I'm a Muslim and I have Muslim friends who feel all the time watched, and the way in which children are being attacked, the hostility with which they are being attacked. So I think we need to see it in so many, and I feel that there is a lot of laziness that crept in post emergency. That all those people who fought against emergency were lazy in terms of looking at the details of the statutes that were there during the emergency. I mean, we were in a conversation with Professor Babu Matthew and Ram Goa on the same book a couple of weeks ago, and Babu made a very interesting point. He said, but it was also a period when very progressive labor laws were brought in. Progressive environmental laws were brought in. But I have an argument against that, and I have always argued with anyone who says Indira Gandhi did a lot for environment, right? But what she did was she created a centralization force, which today Modi is using. She centralized the power. I mean, we could have engaged with states not using their power in environmental management or conservation and shaped it in distinctive ways. What applies to Tamil Nadu need not apply to Karnataka because the environment is diverse as much as our language is diverse, as our food cultures are diverse, as the biomes are diverse, and so on, right? So we needed a multiplicity of approaches. And today we have a uniformity of approach, which is being weakened to corporatize the state and shift wealth from the commons, from the people, into the hands of the capitalist. And the environmental laws are being used for that. And guess what? This happened first in Vajpayee's time. There is something called a Govindarajan Committee on Investment Reforms. Arun Shourie argues, was then the Minister for Disinvestment, argued, and I don't know if he really understood the implication of what he was saying. He said, all these environmental laws, forest protection laws, fundamental rights protection laws are bottlenecks to investment. There's a huge fat report they wrote, and they said we should dilute all of them so that investment flows into the country and India becomes great again, right? Which is exactly what you see happening. TSR Subramanian Committee did the same thing. So there are, in addition to the laziness that crept in to look at the nuances of the implication, why is the local government collapse? So when you ask, how are the people feeling? People are not going to worry about what's happening in parliament, right? People did not know what was happening in the court unless something got reported. Now we have got YouTube, access, and therefore the hijab, for instance, got 6 lakh hits, hijab earrings that were going on. That shows people are concerned. They just were prevented access. Who knows what the 6 lakh people are thinking? Right? There may be 6 lakh families watching, not just 6 lakh individuals. Let's imagine that. Okay, so I think that's the kind of power we now have by technology which can empower us. But that same technology today is used to dissociate our choices from the person I am. For instance, how Aadhaar has been used. You see, and to me the problem with Aadhaar is that it got corporatized so quickly, and Bangalore becomes the sort of the kernel for many of these things. Many of the people we are often meeting with are the very ones who are divorcing the person from the person's choice. Yeah. And I think those engagements we need to have openly now. That is also creeping into the monopolization that is taking place. The use of uniformity is a very clear fascist idea. Diversity attacks fascism. And so that is why they're frightened by diversity. So you have to uniformize, that. I'll stop here.
No, I agree. I mean, of course, as I was saying, there's a long arc to this present moment, both in terms of institutional decay and, as Leo was saying, in terms of the social, economic impulses that have led us to this present moment. So then the question arises: is this unique, or is this just the nature of the Indian state and Indian society? And I think what is distinctive of this moment as a moment, right, as something that can be encapsulated and thought of as its own thing, is that there's some virtue to hypocrisy, which is that if you claim to abide by some values and your actions don't abide by those values, at least you can either be held to account, or there's a space for resistance that opens up between what you claim to do and what you're actually doing. And I think what's happening in this present moment is the legitimation of many of these concerns that Leo is pointing to, or that all of us have been pointing to, as the right way of organizing the state and of organizing society. So that even that veneer of sort of hypocrisy that, so when for example, previous governments have done all these things that we are rightfully critical of, they have at least said that they're abiding by a different set of values, and we can then, therefore, there's that space of resistance. Today, I think what the shift that is happening is also, and this is the totalitarian shift, is the making of the people in the image of the state. Right? It's not the making of the state in the image of the people. The diversity of the people is not reflected in the diversity of the state. The image of the state, or at least the perceived image of the state, of those who hold power at this moment, is sought to be reflected on the people, to have that kind of uniformity of ideology that underlies the present moment. So I do think that, while we've been saying that there is a long arc, both in terms of state and institutional structures, and in terms of our social organization that has led to the present moment, I do think that there's something distinctive happening here that can be analyzed also on its own terms, of course, keeping in mind that sort of long arc that has led us to this present moment.
Thank you, Aparna and Leo. A colleague of mine just yesterday or 2 days ago, is Robin from PUCL. He was saying that we're witnessing something that we can call a breakdown of constitutional governance. And honestly, for me, the Constitution and fundamental rights were barely a small 10 marks test in school. And the only time I started to pay attention was not even 2014, but when the CAA protests started, and when we saw such, great student protests being organized across the country, plus spaces like Shaheen Bagh protests and Bilal Bagh in Bangalore. So for me, that's when I started to learn about the Constitution. And since it's in the title of the book as well, I want to ask you, Arvind, the Constitution, the Constitutional Assembly debates, the vision of people who fought for the freedom from the British Empire, they carry an immense amount of hope for the country today. And how would you speak to that? And what do you think? Why do you think that constitutionalism is something that plays such an important role in this politics of resistance?
Yeah, thank you. In the book, I go back to this lawyer from labor lawyer practicing in Nazi Germany, a man called Ernst Frankel. He writes a book called the Dual State, and the interesting part of it is he writes the book when he's in the middle of the horror that is the Hitler regime, and the ways in which his right to practice is being curtailed by the regime. And in the middle of that, he's trying to theorize and understand what is this regime really about. And he comes up with the idea that the Nazi regime is what he calls a dual state. That is, there is something called the normative state, which is a rule of law state, and there's something called a prerogative state, whose best exemplar is, of course, the Gestapo, which is you get taken in and you have no idea what happens to you. And his point is throughout its rule, the normative state is overrun by the prerogative state, and that's the conflict between these two states. But his point again is a rule of law state is absolutely essential for any kind of a capitalist regime, because of the simple fact you need some sense of uniformity of law. You can't have a law which is completely arbitrary if you want to run a kind of a capitalist regime. So his point is that at all points in time, lawyers in the Nazi regime, their attempt at every point in time is to ensure that you can get people out of the clutches of the prerogative state into the normative state. That's one kind of an example. Then the other example which I went to is an Israeli human rights lawyer called Michael Fard, and he writes a book called The Wall and the Gate. And again, his point is, in the middle of the Israeli regime, which is the occupation, you're constantly challenging the actions of the Israeli regime, be it targeted assassinations, be it building of the wall, be it the practices of torture, etc. And more often than not, you lose. But he says, yet you go to court again and again, and your idea is each time you go to court, you produce an indictment of the regime and of the status quo. And what he says is, again, it's a certain kind of he says you need to have a bit of a historical perspective. He says, see, at some point in time, people didn't think the apartheid regime would collapse. It collapsed. People didn't think that the Berlin Wall would collapse in 1989, but at some point in time, it did collapse. So he says that the work that you do, in a sense, opens out the spaces under the wall, as it were. And at some point, every regime of injustice and evil must collapse. So you can't give up, and you keep working at keeping that normative imagination alive. And that links back to the Constitution. In our context, what is the normative vision to keep alive? The normative vision for us really flows from the Constitution and the ideals which are embodied in the preamble, be it the idea of liberty, be it the idea of equality, be it the idea of fraternity. And again, when we say Constitution, we're not referring to a dull, lifeless document. We're referring to a document which gets its meaning from two struggles. One is the independence struggle, which is against British colonial domination, and second is the struggle against caste domination and gender domination. And so these two struggles really come together in this instrument called the Constitution, and with the values embodied in the preamble. And I think we go back to those values again and again, and even in terms of, for example, any issue, we go back to the idea of, say, the freedom of thought, the freedom of conscience, or the right to equality, the right to dignity. Again, I mean, I'll just make one point and leave it at that. And I think the point is, we need to be able to analyze every contemporary context using the values embodied in the Constitution. And just take one value. I'll just mention one value and leave it at that. Take the value of dignity, which is articulated in the preamble, which is really there because of the fact that, it's a very important from the angle of the anti-caste struggle, as it were. Today, the word dignity means a lot in the context of your freedom to pray. The question of dignity means a lot in the context of the questions of your right to love. It means a lot in all the struggles that we are envisaging and we're imagining. So I think we need to go back to those values, re-imbue those values with meaning, and take the struggle forward, taking the Constitution as a starting point in many ways. Not the starting point, I'll dilute that a little bit and say one of the starting points. We can also go back a little before the Constitution. We can go back to the struggle of Baswa, to the 12th century. We can go back to the range of figures in the Indian context, be it Tagore or be it Gandhi, range of figures we can go to actually. We don't need to limit ourselves to the Constitution, but the broad humanist values can come from a range of sources, really.
Thanks, Arvind. I mean, you've always sort of encouraged all of us, whoever you meet, in fact, to keep this faith and keep this engagement with the Constitution alive. I think I'd like to open it up to the audience now. There was a lot more that could have been discussed, and I hope that there are a lot of you who would like to bring it up. And I also hope that this discussion sort of prompted you to also pick up a copy of the book, because it not just derives its analysis of today from the 75 emergency and the Modi era, but like Arvind has already elaborated, there are testimonies and stories of struggles from the Israel and Palestine region, from Nazi Germany, from South Africa apartheid. And I think that in such times of darkness, for someone like me, it's just been a real crack that's letting in the light to know what this darkness is, and to know what history this darkness has, and to know what could possibly lie ahead. So, as Ravi has said, anyone who has any question,
Aishwarya,
any
can I
thoughts?
just read out that passage? Because
Yes,
I think
yes.
just give me a minute. Yeah.
Sure.
I'm reading a passage out, and maybe you guys can tell us if you have read the book. You will know who said it. And this is about the emergency. This is the experience of the emergency of 1975. The most alarming aspect of the emergency was that Indira Gandhi managed to demonstrate how easy it was to misuse the constitution and convert democracy into a constitutional dictatorship. In this journey, she seemed to have picked up some clues from Adolf Hitler. He had a 25-point program, she had a 20-point program. The state of the economy, and this is the alarming aspect, The state of the economy during the emergency was alarming. The growth rate was modest, and inflation rose to record highs. Nevertheless, the emergency regime declared that India was growing. Who was left to question the propaganda? I mean, to me, this reads like it could be written for our times. But do you know who wrote this? Arun Jaitley. It is in the foreword to Kumi Kapoor's book on the emergency.
Thank you. Yes, please come forward. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for a good discussion. Having bought the book, I will definitely buy the book. One or two points which I wanted to ask you and get you some responses is, we were comparing emergency of 75 and the current situation for us. I don't have a vivid memory of emergency, but what I heard is, that was a tactical act by Mrs. Indira Gandhi to get over a political crisis she had. And like any tactical activity, the society and the country came out of it with some damages, but we mostly came out of it. So I would say, I'm not justifying anything, but I would say that it had impact, but it was a limited tactical impact to the society, but we could understand what could happen and we could come out. But what we see today is more of strategic. A society is being, I wouldn't say reformed, but re-engineered to a different coordinate level. So therefore, it may not be easily visible, but it is being done to you behind your back. You don't know it's happening to you, but it's happening. So to that extent, though they are comparable, but they are strategically, one is tactical, this is strategic. That is, so I would like to get some members, if I have allowed to ask one more. Yeah. Second issue is law enforcement has agencies. At times, even courts have become part and partners to the political masters. Now, if somebody is arrested for a suspected crime and reasonable time is given, and if it takes 10 years, 15 years for him to be acquitted, why isn't the law enforcement agencies being questioned? Why there is no punishment for the policemen who framed the cases against him? And finally, it fell flat. And who is compensating the victim for his 15 years lost in jail? So where can we have an accountability to the law enforcement agencies? If that comes, the political masters may not behave the way they are behaving today. Because this policeman may think to his boy, am I going to get jacked after some time? So there I have more, but I am leaving it. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for that question. I agree with you on the first point in terms of the looking at the difference between the declared emergency and the undeclared emergency and your language of tactical and strategic. I think that's a point which, in a sense, I was trying to make as well. You're right. The emergency of 75 to 77 was what you called a tactical move to get over a difficulty at that particular moment in time. And I think the point which we're making in this case is we're not talking about power for its own sake, but we're talking about power which is really meant to remake society in the image of what this particular regime believes in. And that's a question of interference with the range of fundamental freedoms which we have as a people. So you're completely right, and I agree with you on that particular analysis. On the second question is a very important one, and leave it to Aparna to answer.
Thank you. There are ways in which you could imagine that consolidated power or concentrated power can be attacked, right? And over time, you could create institutional mechanisms to check that power. You can fragment that power in different ways. You can create a political culture where power is questioned, and questioning of power is encouraged and supported and almost seen as a patriotic duty. And you could imagine, different ways in which one could go. What you're talking about is creating institutional structures which will not allow for power concentration. And we have different kinds of those institutional structures that are imagined in the Constitution that one feels have either decayed or been captured or are otherwise complicit. And completely agreeing with you, there was this case of, there was some bomb blast in Ahmedabad and there was some terror accused there, and one person called Ajam Bhai. Ajam Bhai spent, I think, if I remember correctly, 18 years in prison and is ultimately acquitted by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says that not only is he not guilty, but this case was manufactured against him, right? So then Ajam Bhai files a petition in the court and says, compensate me for taking away this much of my time. The state, you're saying that the state is complicit in what has happened to me, so then I should be compensated. And the Supreme Court says, well, if we do that, that will open the floodgates, right? You're absolutely right. I mean, I'm just giving this as an example of exactly what you're saying. But I think there's a larger point here as well, which is that, again, I'm thinking of something that Arvind mentions in his book, is A.K. Gopalan, the communist leader, tries to fly the flag on the 15th of August 1947, and he's charged with sedition. He was in prison, and he's charged with sedition. And when he goes before the magistrate, he tells the magistrate, India is free. I am flying the Indian flag. What is your problem? And the magistrate said, and now we are free. You can't use the same law against me that till yesterday we were fighting against. And the magistrate says, I'm sorry, that's not my job, right? How have we reimagined the role of the courts and the role of the police, which were central to the colonial rule, to upholding the colonial rule? How have we reimagined those roles in the constitution? I don't think we've really done that, right? Just in terms of our own political culture, police reforms haven't happened. I mean, that's a longer conversation, but we are still governed by many of the same police codes, the police acts, the police manuals that we had, that were used to subjugate us as a population. And so that, again, with the courts, with the lower courts in particular, how have we reimagined their role under the constitution? I think there's a failure here. There's a failure of constitutional imagination for the institutions that we have. And again, going forward, come the day of reckoning, that's something that we will have to very seriously consider.
Hello. Yeah, good evening. I'm Sanjay Ketkar. One of the things that if you see the economic development and progress of all the countries that have prospered, not a single country has prospered under democracy. They first had some way of suppressing some part of the population through undemocratic way, and then only they prospered. So is it a strategic thinking right now that to develop the country, because not a single instance is there in the world where a pure democracy is prospered on its own. First they prospered and then they moved to democracy. So do you think it's a designed way of doing that way, to actually get India prosper, and then probably think about democracy and all those other ideas?
No, I want you to read the book by Shashi Tharoor, An Era of Darkness. In that he makes a comment. He basically explains how the East India Company, for instance, came and took over and destroyed the Mughal Empire and all of that. But he narrates one aspect of the Indian economy when the East India Company stepped in. Do you know what the contribution of Indian economy was to global GDP at that time? 28%. And when the British left? 2%. So now, isn't that an argument against your question? Because India was not, India was like, if Naipaul has to be believed, is 1 million mutinies were happening, right? So we were a rather decentralized economy, but with the idea of confederalism. Okay? Which is the same idea, which I don't know if you have heard of Abdullah Öcalan. He is a guy who has been put away in prison in Turkey, in an island where there are 2,000 guards basically watching him for 20 years. He is the leader of the Kurdish people. And he argues for the same type of an economic system. He says what we now need, what the world needs to imagine, is an idea of democratic confederalism beyond a nation state. And the Kurdish people have been, for the last 100 years, by every possible power, attacked, butchered, their language banned. And when you talk about, hijab and this, they've suffered all of it over the last 100 years. If you speak in Turkey in the Kurdish language, you can be put away for a long period of time. Just because you spoke Kannada, for instance. Just imagine that, right? If you wear a particular their attire, you're gone. You may never come back. So think of disappearances in Kashmir, for instance, or in Manipur. Santosh Hegde went and did a commission of it. So it's happening here as well, but it's happened at a much larger scale. And so the revolution, and that's also alludes to your question of, are we going through an age of darkness? These are people who have gone through it. And I don't know if you have seen, if you have heard accounts of what ISIS did, especially to the Yazidi and the Kurdish people. The most horrific violence, unimaginable violence. So you would think the society has broken down, it will never rise, it can never come up. And there's no democracy there in the sense you and I understand it, where we go to vote and then somebody gets set up. So what the people did in a place called Rojava, or Rojava if you want to put it that way, it's in northern Syria. They organized themselves. The women formed armies to self-protect themselves, because one of the problems of totalitarian state or the ISIS type of, I don't know what to call it, the evil, women become the victims. That is why you should understand what the hijab is about. You have to target the women. Then you disintegrate the family inside. You make the family vulnerable, weak, and disempowered. Right? So, in Rojava, what they did was they reorganized themselves, and any committee that is set up by them has to have half of the committee women. If there is a chairperson, one of them has to be a woman. So the other person becomes a vice chairperson, could be a man, right? These type of very sort of grainy details revive the economy there. So they have become a net exporter of wheat from a region which was starving for food in just 7 years. And so if Erdogan wants to really crush the Kurdish people, he has to cut off their supply chains, because they know how to survive without the so-called state that we have. So we also need to reimagine democracy in a conceptual framework. The idea of conceptual, the democratic confederalism is not one where there is a rigid state. And if the state becomes amorphous, I'm telling you, we can solve climate change problem. The problem today we have with IPCC and other things is that the state has become rigid. We are walling nation-state boundaries. We're not seeing the challenges that we are going to have in the next 20, 30 years. And we are, happily being distracted by this or that controversy. And, like Jaitley is right. Whenever the state is crumbling from within, to use your metaphor of the termite, we must also worry whether the emergency is knocking on our doors. So I don't know if I've really directly answered it, but it's not an easy answer I can give for that.
If I may, I was reminded of this cartoon that I saw, and I don't remember who made it. So to set the scene, there's an older man pontificating, as is normally the case, to a group of younger people in front of a wooden fire, and the surrounding is a very barren land. And he's saying, yes, of course, we ended up destroying the earth, but for a short period of time, we created immense value for our shareholders. Right? So I was just thinking, prosperity at what cost? Right? And the second is prosperity for whom? Right? I mean, if there is prosperity, and if prosperity is a goal, it should be for the people, right? Or at least a larger segment of people rather than two people. So, I mean, the question then is, prosperity for whom? What does it mean to tell someone, yes, of course, we are locking you up, but, the nation will prosper. Who is the nation, right? What's the imagination of the nation beyond the people who make up the nation?
Just a brief point. I know there's one thinker like Susan George, for instance, looked at the deep state and how it works. So, for instance, look at Davos. Davos makes the kind of argument which you just put it in your question, right? It wants to create the state which looks liberal from the outside, but really is caught within by the corporate cabal that controls it. Is that democracy? So if you really want to imagine deep democracy, please read Article 39 of the Constitution. 39B in particular, that the production of the nation state cannot end up in the hands of a few. That language, what does it actually sort of speak for? an imagination where you won't have super rich people like Ambani, Adani, or even in Bangalore, 100,000 plus millionaires. You see what I'm saying? It creates acute poverty. And if you see the disparity reports in the last 3 years, shocking. So I don't think that we can make a very simple statement. But this scenario must be always kept in mind.
Thank you. I have seen the 1975 emergency in very close quarters because I was also in the student union. So I was studying in National College during those days, and the emergency was imposed. All my lectures disappeared, including some of our leaders. I'm very happy that I'm to bring out a book, Undeclared Emergency at the Present Context. I just want to know, after these 5 state elections by March, will it be a reality? It will be declared emergency.
I was just saying, why do you need to declare an emergency anymore? The de jure does a lot more work than the de facto. So if you can do all that Indira Gandhi did and much more today without declaring an emergency, then it gives you potential deniability as well. I don't think we are headed towards the declaration of an emergency unless things change very drastically on the ground. At least that's my...
I just had one more point to that. I also make the point that the idea of a totalitarian regime, I derive from one lens where he makes the point that totalitarian regime is based on a certain kind of popular support, based on a kind of ideological framework. And that's the point we're seeing today. And it's based on the fact that, elections are a way of demonstrating the popularity of the leader. Those are all points we see today. So this regime is not scared of the people. It derives its support from a section of the people as well, and that makes it a far more difficult regime to shake, because it's not just based on the state alone, but has its roots in society as well. So going back to that point, then you don't really need to declare an emergency, because you don't just control the power of the state, but you also have a certain kind of an inroad into societal ways of thinking, certain kind of networks in society as well, which makes it a far more challenging situation today and makes the question of a de jure emergency almost infructuous. You don't really need that.
I just had a point here. Okay, this is, I see Vinod Vyaslu is here, and my friend Subrayan Prasanna would talk to us about the Ripon doctrine. When Mayo, for instance, came after the Sepoy mutiny, he basically set up this effective state, right? And so Bangalore, for instance, has adopted the Mayo doctrine in the way it works. The fact that we don't have planning, which is decentralized and representative, and there are strong arguments made against that. And the state, how can you have 60, 70 million people planned by a bunch of 40, 50 ministers? Basically, that's how the state is running. And the entire country is running on the same model, right? Whereas Ripon, who came after him and said, one of the first reforms he brought was to free the vernacular press, which was crushed. And people, if you printed in Bengali or Oriya or Punjabi or whatever, you would be arrested. So he allowed that to happen. But Ripon went on to set up the local government framework. Right? And look at what happened to India after that. All our statespersons, every Motilal Nehru to Jawaharlal Nehru to Tilak, every one of them were leaders, were the outcome of municipal politics. Radha Krishnan. So today what we have is that we do not have the capacity of throwing up genuine leadership, and which is why it creates a condition, it creates a power vacuum, which can only be occupied by lumpen politics, which has become systemic. You have to buy your way with 5 crores minimum to be an MLA, 50 crores to be an MP. And they say it openly. And today you can also kind of terrorize civil society by saying you cannot get foreign money unless Amit Shah approves it. But if you are a political party, we have a separate sideshow for you. It's all in the open, right? So if this is not the conditions under which the state has collapsed for the ideas of freedom, liberty, and so on, what then is?
I'd like to, Leo, you were alluding to there being a silent majority, but from my limited worldview amongst my peers and people whom I grew up with and my family, I see a huge silent majority with whom I don't seem to find a language to communicate. I'd like to go back to what Aparna mentioned about what your father felt, right? There is this sense of fear. This is exactly what a lot of people in my life, my family, my friends, the fact that even this t-shirt seems to be like making a statement, right? So they're worried. Hey, why are you wearing these t-shirts so often, right? Going back, perhaps from the emergency days, maybe this sense of fear was more universal than what it is today. I don't know. But today there seems to be um, people who are okay with that fear, who seem to be okay. But I am lost, not being able to find a language to communicate with such people. Could you throw some light on, something from the past or through your readings that what could be a language to communicate with this silent majority? I do believe there is a silent majority. What could be a language to communicate with this majority?
Yeah, no, I'll just make maybe one point. Is I think the question of fear is a real one, but I think the point really about fear is how do you then overcome fear? How do you then get free from fear? That's really the challenge we have before us. And at least in the book, I go back a little bit I go back a lot to Hannah Arendt's work, and she makes this point about a totalitarian regime really thrives on what she calls a sense of isolation. When she says isolation, it means that I'm in my separate world, Aishwarya is in a separate world, we don't speak to each other, and we're both scared, both scared of this larger overwhelming power called the state. And so the only way forward is for me and Aishwarya to get together, start talking, start communicating, and start doing something together. So one way of breaking fear is really through community of action. So I think in a sense, what that throws up is what is absolutely vital and important is in the context of fear, you say we are going to overcome that fear. And how do you overcome that fear? Overcoming the fear is really about collectives. It's about being together. It's about being in the anti-CAA protest. It's about being in the range of environmental protests that Leo's been heading for so many years. And it's about participating also in discussions such as this, And it's about building that sense of community, which can help you overcome that sense of fear. And of course, once you overcome a sense of fear, language will come. You'll develop languages in which you can speak, in which you can question or challenge. And you look at the languages which emerge in the sometimes the most difficult context. Think of someone like Munawar Farooqi from Gujarat. He's coming from Gujarat. He's living, of course, in Maharashtra for a number of years. And he develops a certain language of humor in which he challenges the authority of the state. So there's a range of ways in which people develop languages which challenge, in a sense, the authority of the state using the values of the constitution, but coming from many, many sources. Again, I refer a little bit, I think there's a lot here, but there's a lot in terms of the entire language, going back to our own state in Karnataka, the language of Baswa, right? And why should we not go back to the language of Baswa or the philosophy of Baswa to try and to challenge the love jihad laws? Why is a love jihad law, which is born in Uttar Pradesh, terrorizing the people of Karnataka? Why is it there? When Basava, in the 12th century, puts forward the idea that when you marry across lines of caste, it's not a marriage, it's a revolution. That's the philosophy of the state. So we need to go back to those languages.
I have a question on dissent, which you made a couple of points saying that we are not a vast submissive majority. There are pockets of resistance like POSCO, Naga, and you said you see a ray of light. So I just want to bring about two large dissents we had. One was CAA, which was really a ray of hope. Everybody, it was mass movement. And the whole thing was just cut in one instant by a lockdown, the world's biggest lockdown. The farm law, 2 years they struggled, nobody even recognized them, nobody even acknowledged them. And then now they've gone back, no MSP, no Home Minister resigning. So they've just been snuffed out. So to really feel that, there is some dissent possible.
No, it's interesting that you raised the issue of dissent, but I just want to, and since you said the farm laws, I wrote a paper, I don't know if it's a long paper, if you want to read it, you can read it. It's a critique of the so-called climate resilient zero budget natural farming. Okay, this was Azim Premji gave 100 crores to build the program in Andhra Pradesh because Chandrababu Naidu championed it, Davos supported it, UN General Assembly also echoed in support, UNEP was one of the sort of, proactive supporters along with WWF and so on. So you see an whole assemblage of corporate, conservation and financial. The whole cost was $2 billion to turn all of Andhra Pradesh into a natural farming state. I had a problem with that. I said, did the farmers decide it? Okay, now they are using pesticide and this and that, but aren't we doing the same thing that Green Revolution did? Because Green Revolution imposed on the farmers a situation where the farmers had no choice. And we saw the crisis that ended up where farmers killed themselves by the hundreds of thousands, right? So that's a real serious crisis which, as Sainath has documented, we declared a state of emergency on the farming community of India for decades, right? Took away the sense of self-empowerment that built this region. This was, as Albert Howard writes in his book on India's agriculture, this was where this is like the mother of this region was the mother of agriculture. So the idea is the culture of being sovereign. The farmer is sovereign. And we must really understand what that means. So when Andhra Pradesh, the chief minister, decides to not allow the Panchayat Raj department and Panchayat Raj system be involved in that choice, creates a parastatal, just like BDA and BMRD and all those parastatals play around with our lives with land use planning here, but they did it for the entire state. And then he goes to Davos. And then he gets $2 billion financing done for that. And he says in 5 years it will change. I critiqued it. I wrote a paper. I got a lot of flack from several leading farmers' representatives also, saying that, we are shifting to natural farming and you work with an environmental organization and you're criticizing it. I was saying this is a failure of constitutionalism. This is a failure of governance. Here the corporate sector is taking over the entire farming machinery, if you want to put it that way. So we need to be aware. Take the farm laws and look at the contract, look at the nature of the laws. It will end up creating the same system which Andhra Pradesh experimented with, and it failed. But when Modi finally agreed that he has to repeal the farm laws, do you know what he promoted? Zero budget natural farming. The same model in Andhra Pradesh across the country. And you must really wonder why he did that. And the core of zero budget natural farming is the cow. And when I say that, you know what it means. So there is dissent against that. The farmers have said we cannot be part of a corporatized farming system because we have suffered from it for decades. Just because Europe wants to eat natural foods and someone wants to finance it, that's not our choice. But see what has happened this year. The Biodiversity Act. Comprehensively it is being proposed for amendment. It takes away the sovereignty of the most fundamental value I have as an individual is what I eat, what I grow, how I eat, how I share. That is being corporatized and put in the hands of the corporate sector, which is not accountable to the farmer or the state even. So you can see that there is a very well thought out strategy in taking away the power of sovereignty. If the preamble says anything in one simple word, it says it's a sovereign people, not a sovereign state. So if we lose that connect with sovereignty, then there's no point having liberal values and etc., because that I think is very fundamental. And I want to end by saying that the other dimension you can also see it from is, and that is what Wilson alludes to in the private members bill he has promoted on the education thing. I was just looking at the Farm Act. Firstly, I was wondering, does the union government even have the power to promote farm acts? Because if you take the state list and the concurrent list, state list has 19 entries which relate to farming, which are with the state government. There are 5 or 6 entries in the 11th schedule which relate to local government related to farming. In the union list, 0. So how did the union government? So the real question we should have is, are we carefully and assiduously and sort of proactively and being alert to the erosion of sovereignty? It can happen through education, it can happen to farming, it can happen to what you wear, it can happen to who you love. It can happen in every dimension. That, I think, is what is happening. It's been happening for a while through the capitalist imposition on, Aadhaar is what? How can you get the right to document who I am if I don't consent to it? And yet, you're forcing me to. If I don't comply, then I am an illegal person. What was CAA about? So I think this is happening systematically and structurally. So like Arvind said, and I completely agree. Every time there is a small resistance, small dissent, I always try and participate because I always find it difficult that, we end up there in the middle of traffic. Why is the police cornering us into that Mysore Bank circle? We used to be in front of town hall with dignity, yeah? I used to protest in a corporation office. I cannot do that anymore. So I think one of the major revolutions that has to actually happen is we should reclaim our right to protest in Vidhan Sabha. Only the Dalits do it. None of us people, sometimes the lawyers do it. None of us do it. We should go and sit there. We used to run up and down the steps. So I think there is a symbolic struggle that we are not participating in, that we must actually reclaim those spaces which they have sort of kidnapped from us.
Thank you, Leo. Thank you, Aparna and Arvind. Thank you so much for your questions as well. That brought a lot of meaning to close this discussion at this note as well, that there's a lot yet to do. There's a lot of work to do. I just want to end on a note that in Arvind's book, where he talks about human rights lawyering, but I think it could apply to all of us, where he says that, I think this is Michael Fard, where in the Israel-Palestine area, the fact that the lawyers are fighting cases every day, relentlessly, was in a way placing on record that they are dissenting against the state every day. And they're sort of creating that kind of history in just doing that every day. So I think his question was also that such big protests happened, but it was all just pushed under the carpet. For me, the only reason I feel like there's still a lot of the same kind of energy to bring back and revive is that we have to keep saying this every day. And I think that's the hope that I get out of the work we do. So thank you, Leo. Thank you.